12 hours before it collapsed, the man who built it stood at its base and told his own engineers it was perfectly safe. 12 hours. That's all the warning Southern California got before 200 feet of concrete gave way just before midnight, unleashing 12 billion gallons of water into a sleeping valley. By sunrise, over 400 people were dead, entire towns had simply vanished, and the most trusted engineer in America was about to become the most hated man in the state. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. This is San Francisco Canyon, 40 miles north of Los Angeles. In 1928, it held one of the largest dams on Earth, a 200-foot wall of concrete built to quench the thirst of a booming American city. The man behind it was William Mulholland, the most powerful engineer in America, a self-taught genius who had already pulled off the impossible once before. But 3 questions still haunt this story nearly a century later. First, how does a dam inspected and approved just hours earlier simply cease to exist? Second, why did the men closest to the warning signs, cracks, leaks, a sagging road, keep telling themselves everything was fine? And third, the one that still divides historians. Was this really an accident, or the price of one man's unchecked power? By the time you understand what happened in this canyon, you'll never look at a dam or a confident expert the same way again. To understand why this dam had to fail, you need to understand the man who built it, and the city that demanded it. William Mulholland arrived in America from Ireland in 1874. A teenage sailor with no formal education and no money. He drifted west working odd jobs until he landed in Los Angeles and took work as a ditch digger for the city's private water company. He was nobody, but Mulholland had one gift that would define the next 50 years of Southern California. He read obsessively, taught himself engineering and geology from library books at night, and he never forgot a single detail about the water system running beneath the streets. Within a decade, he wasn't digging ditches anymore. He was running the entire department. By the early 1900s, Los Angeles had a problem no engineer had ever solved at this scale. The city was growing faster than almost anywhere on Earth, from 11,000 people in 1880 to over 100,000 by 1900, and it wasn't slowing down. The Los Angeles River, the only real water source the city had, was already running dry in summer months. Real estate developers, orange growers, and city boosters were all selling the same dream, an endless desert paradise. But paradise needed water it simply didn't have. Without a new source, Los Angeles's growth and its fortune would collapse. Mulholland's answer was audacious. 230 miles north, the Owens Valley held a river fed by Sierra Nevada snowmelt. If Los Angeles could build an aqueduct across mountains and desert to capture that water and funnel it south, the city's future would be secured. Critics called it impossible. Mulholland spent nearly 6 years building it anyway, through blistering heat, labor strikes, and financial crises, completing the Los Angeles Aqueduct in 1913. When the water finally came thundering down the spillway in front of 40,000 spectators, Mulholland turned to the crowd and said only 5 words.
There it is.
There it is.
Take it.
He became an American legend overnight. The self-taught immigrant who had tamed the desert. Statues were planned. Streets were named after him. He was, by every measure, untouchable. But success created a new pressure. The aqueduct brought water, but not storage. If an earthquake ever severed the aqueduct's supply line, or a drought hit the Sierra snowpack, Los Angeles needed massive reservoirs close to the city, insurance against the day the tap ran dry. So throughout the 1920s, as the city's population doubled again, swelling past 500,000, Mulholland pushed to build a network of storage dams along the aqueduct route. One of them, in a quiet, narrow gorge called San Francisco Canyon, would become the St. Francis Dam. Construction began in 1924. It was designed, approved, and overseen almost entirely by one man, Mulholland himself, with no independent geological survey of the canyon walls it would rest against. Nobody outside his own department seriously reviewed the site. Living just a quarter-mile downstream from the dam, in a small cottage with his family, was the dam keeper, Tony Harnischfeger. He and his young son knew every sound that canyon made: the wind through the rocks, the hum of the powerhouse turbines, the creak of the wooden footbridge. To them, this wasn't a monument to engineering. It was simply home. When the reservoir began filling in 1926, Harnischfeger was the first to notice something the official reports would later dismiss again and again: cracks spreading across the dam's face, and water, muddy water, seeping through where it shouldn't. He called it in. Mulholland came out personally, examined the cracks, and pronounced them completely normal for a structure this size. It happened once, then it happened again. And each time the answer was the same: nothing to worry about. March 12, 1928 began like any other Monday. But by mid-morning, something had changed. Harnischfeger walked the base of the dam and found a new leak. This one different from the others. Not clear seepage, but muddy, discolored water pouring from the western abutment, where the dam met solid rock. Mud meant something underneath was washing away. He didn't wait. He called Mulholland directly and told him to come see it himself. By 11:30 that morning, Mulholland arrived at the canyon with his top assistant, Harvey Van Norman. Together, the two most experienced dam engineers in California walked the structure for nearly an hour. They examined the muddy leak. They noted a new crack running along the base. They even discussed briefly whether to lower the reservoir as a precaution. Then they looked at each other, and Mulholland made his decision. The leak was consistent with normal settling. The crack was nothing new. The dam, he said, was perfectly safe. He and Van Norman got back in the car and drove back to Los Angeles for lunch. 12 hours later, that dam would no longer exist. Through the afternoon, life in the canyon continued as if nothing was wrong. Workers at the nearby powerhouse finished their shifts. Ranch families along the Santa Clara River, 40 miles downstream, put their children to bed. None of them had ever heard the name St. Francis Dam. Why would they? It was just a piece of infrastructure, quietly doing its job, holding back 12 billion gallons of water above their homes. At around 11:30 that night, a motorcycle patrolman named Ace Hopewell rode past the dam on a routine check of the aqueduct road. As he climbed away from the canyon, he felt something strange beneath him, a low rumble in the earth, and behind him, the sound of what he later described as rocks or timber crashing together. He assumed it was just another rock slide, common in these canyons, and kept riding. He had no idea he had just become the last human being to see the St. Francis Dam standing, and to survive what came next. At 11:57 p.m., without a single further warning, the dam failed. Modern engineers believe the eastern hillside it was anchored into, a bed of ancient, weak, water-saturated rock, simply gave way beneath the pressure it had held back for less than 2 years. In seconds, nearly the entire 200-foot structure was gone, and 12 billion gallons of water were released into the canyon as a single moving wall. In places, over 140 feet high. The first to die were the ones who lived closest. Tony Harnischfeger, his young son, and everyone else at the powerhouse camp a quarter-mile downstream were killed almost instantly, swallowed by a wave moving faster than they could ever have run. From there, the flood didn't slow down. It surged down the narrow canyon at speeds up to 18 miles an hour, tearing out roads, rail lines, and everything built in its path. Within an hour, the wave reached the town of Castaic Junction, flattening a construction camp of workers who had no warning at all. It kept moving, through orchards, through farmland, gaining width as the canyon opened into the wider Santa Clara River Valley. By 2 in the morning, it reached the town of Peru, and then Fillmore, sweeping away homes, livestock, and entire families in the dark. most of them asleep when the water arrived. Frantic phone calls and motorcycle riders raced ahead of the flood, trying to warn towns before the wave reached them. Some people escaped to higher ground in time. Many did not. In Santa Paula, operators stayed at their switchboards, making warning calls even as water began rising around them, refusing to leave until the last possible second. By dawn, the flood had traveled 54 miles from the dam site, through 5 counties worth of destruction, and emptied into the Pacific Ocean near Ventura, carrying with it homes, cars, animals, and bodies that would wash up on beaches for weeks afterward. As the sun rose over Southern California on March 13th, entire communities that had existed the night before were simply gone. And the man who had inspected that dam and called it safe just 12 hours earlier was about to wake up to the news. Dawn on March 13th revealed a landscape that no longer resembled anything from the day before. Where orchards, ranches, and small towns had stood along the Santa Clara River, there was now only mud, wreckage, and silence. Rescue crews arriving from Los Angeles didn't find a disaster zone so much as an entirely erased stretch of Southern California. Bridges were gone. Roads had vanished under 10 feet of silt. Entire foundations of homes had been scraped clean off the earth, as if they had never existed at all. The scale of the search was staggering. Bodies were found miles from where their homes had once stood, some tangled in orchard trees, others buried under debris that would take days or weeks to clear. Search parties worked the riverbanks all the way to the Pacific Ocean, where bodies and wreckage had washed up on beaches near Ventura. Some victims were never recovered at all, swept out to sea and lost permanently. For years afterward, remains would occasionally surface, a grim reminder that no one, not even in 1928, could say with certainty how many had truly died. The official count settled at several hundred, but historians to this day still argue whether the true number was closer to 400 or well over 5. For William Mulholland, the reckoning came almost immediately. Within days, he was called before a coroner's inquest to explain what had happened, a public hearing where he would have to account for a dam he had personally designed, personally approved, and personally inspected less than 12 hours before it failed. Reporters and grieving families packed the room. And when it was his turn to speak, the man who had once told a cheering crowd, "There it is, take it," said something very different. He told the jury plainly that if there had been an error in judgment, the error was his, and his alone. That they should not look for anyone else to blame. It was, in its own way, a stunning moment. The most powerful engineer in California, a man once treated as untouchable, standing before the public and accepting total personal responsibility for hundreds of deaths. But taking responsibility did not undo what had happened, and it did not stop the search for deeper causes. Investigators began digging into the ground itself, literally, to understand why a structure built to the era's highest engineering standards could fail so completely, so fast, with almost no warning at all. Here is what investigators eventually uncovered, and it changes everything about how we understand this disaster. The St. Francis Dam wasn't just unlucky. It was built on ground that should have disqualified the site entirely if anyone outside Mulholland's own department had been allowed to properly examine it first. The dam's eastern hillside was anchored into a formation called mica schist, a type of rock that looks solid on the surface but is actually made of thin paper-like layers that can slide against each other, especially once saturated with water. The western side was anchored into something almost as troubling, an ancient landslide deposit, essentially compacted gravel and rock debris, not solid bedrock at all. In between, part of the dam sat on a layer of material that could actually dissolve when soaked in water for long enough. In other words, this 200-foot concrete structure was resting on two different types of unstable ground, with a third weak layer in between, and nobody had properly tested any of it before construction began. For nearly 2 years, filled with water, that fragile foundation had been slowly failing from the inside. The mica schist softening, sliding, losing its grip, while the western landslide material shifted under the growing weight. The crack's harnish Fazier reported. The sagging roadbed motorists had noticed for days. The muddy leak on the morning of March 12th. None of it was normal settling, as Mulholland believed. Every single warning sign was the foundation itself quietly giving way, hours and days before the final collapse. And this is the twist that reframes the entire tragedy. This wasn't a freak accident that no one could have predicted. It was a foreseeable geological failure, hidden behind the reputation of one man so trusted, so experienced, and so used to being right, that an entire city's safety rested on his judgment alone. With no second opinion required, no independent oversight, and no one with the authority to override him. The very system that built Los Angeles into a modern metropolis had also created a single point of failure. And on March 12, 1928, that point of failure gave way. But the most haunting part of this story isn't the geology. It's what happened to the man at the center of it. The coroner's jury ultimately cleared William Mulholland of criminal responsibility. They ruled that neither he nor anyone else at the Bureau of Waterworks and Supply could reasonably have known about the hidden instability of that canyon's rock. Legally, he walked away untouched. But the jury added one line to their findings that would outlive every headline from that spring: that the construction and operation of a great dam should never again be left to the sole judgment of one man, no matter how eminent. That line was the real verdict, not a crime. A warning about power itself, about what happens when society hands one person total authority and calls it expertise. Mulholland never faced prison. He faced something arguably worse. He resigned from the department he had built from nothing before the year was even out, and he withdrew almost entirely from public life. The man who once stood before 40,000 cheering spectators spent his final years largely alone, reportedly consumed by guilt for the rest of his life. He died 7 years later, in 1935, having never fully returned to the public eye. And here's the twist within the twist. The very disaster that ended his career is the reason engineers can now say with real confidence that something like this could never happen again in America the same way. Because in the wake of the St. Francis collapse, California did something it had never done before. It required, by law, that no dam could ever again be built or operated under the judgment of a single, unchecked engineer. Independent state oversight, geological surveys, licensed supervision, all of it exists today because of what happened in that canyon. The very system of checks that might have stopped this disaster only came into existence because of it. Nearly a century later, the St. Francis Dam remains one of the worst civil engineering disasters in American history, and its wreckage still sits quietly in that canyon today. A scattered concrete memorial nobody built on purpose. But every dam inspected in this country now, every independent geological survey, every safety regulation that exists specifically so one person's confidence can never again decide the fate of an entire valley. All of it traces back to this single night in 1928. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many of the systems we trust today are still resting on nothing more than one expert's word? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want to go further down this rabbit hole of American disasters and cover-ups, subscribe, because this is only the beginning.